But before I introduce how we're going to approach as a panel the topic of this morning's session, could I ask you all to stand up? Okay, we can sit down. Now, one lesson we can draw from what we just did is that you can't say that teachers and professors have no power, because they do, as we just saw. But my purpose in beginning this way is not to be obnoxious about that fact, but rather to dramatize the fact that one of the main origins of progressive education, especially as studied and articulated by philosophers of education here at Teachers College over the last century, is to help us think about authority in education. That is, to help us think about not only who decides what education is, or what education should be, but how to ask intelligent questions about the very meaning of education and why we would want to have formal education in the first place in our society, which is the issue of purpose that Ellen Lagerman emphasized in her lecture on Larry Kremen's work, the really important issue of purpose. A related origin and feature of progressive education is that in its best expressions, it also unsettles and discomforts us. It unsettles and discomforts us. A fact I also tried to dramatize by asking you so abruptly to stand and sit after you'd already been comfortably seated. For progressive education also arose in response to how easy and how problematic it can be to settle into particular educational habits that as such may no longer be subject to question or may no longer be subject to inquiry. So, and including, paradoxically enough, habitual ideas about what progressive education itself means. This morning we're going to address the issue of progressive education, especially as studied and articulated by a litany of famous philosophers of education here at our college. Our presenters, as Fran mentioned, including yours truly as chair of the session, we're all members or past members of our college's historic program in philosophy and education. What we're going to do is work as follows. Megan will begin with some comments on William Heard Kilpatrick, whose face you've seen on these rotating slides earlier this morning. Stephanie will then offer some comments about John Dewey. Then Jahsee will offer some comments on George Counts. And then Darryl will offer some remarks on Maxine Greene. And we will have time for discussion, so let me invite you and encourage you to keep track of any questions or comments you'd like to offer in our discussion portion. So I'm going to pass it to you, Megan.
If I was to give a title to these remarks, it would be The Projected as Method, a reappraisal of William Heard Kilpatrick's The Project Method. I had read about Kilpatrick's life when I joined the Teachers College faculty in 2005, but I had not studied his scholarship until fairly recently. I think I must have assumed, like so many others, that the criticisms of Kilpatrick that were in the air were true. These criticisms include that he was to be blamed for encouraging anti-intellectualism among classroom teachers, and that Lawrence Kremen was right, that, quote, in seeking to make Dewey's ideas manageable for mass consumption by the teaching profession, Kilpatrick had ended up by transforming them into a version quite different from the original. That's from Kremen's book, The Transformation of the School, page 221. Upon reading the project method and foundations of method, I could see why such criticisms had been made, but I also could see something much more profound, and it's that something that I hope to share with you today. My brief presentation divides into 3 parts: a biographical sketch, an overview of the project method, and a commentary on the task ahead of us. So, a biographical sketch. Kilpatrick was born in Georgia in 1871 and died at the age of 93 in New York City in 1965. Educated at Mercer University and Johns Hopkins University, Kilpatrick spent time in the K-12 schools before returning to Mercer University to teach mathematics and take up senior administrative positions. He first met Dewey in 1898 when he began to seriously consider a career in the history and philosophy of education. In 1906, after resigning from Mercer University over irreconcilable theological differences with the trustees, Kilpatrick decided to undertake graduate study with Dewey at Teachers College, matriculating the very next year. And so began Kilpatrick's very long association with Teachers College. He was a student in the college until 1912, when he was awarded his PhD. Having worked as a lecturer from 1909, he was promoted to assistant professor in 1911, and shortly thereafter, in 1915, to associate professor and then full professor in 1918. He became emeritus in 1937. Kilpatrick was known as Columbia's $1 million professor because of the great popularity and revenue of his classes. His classes registered students in the hundreds, and Kremen estimates that over the course of his career here, he probably taught about 35,000 students from all states across the country, as well as other countries. If you're interested in reading more about Kilpatrick, I recommend a biography of him by John A. Beinecke, and it's called And There Were Giants in the Land, The Life of William Heard Kilpatrick. And if you're interested in why he might have been such a powerful teacher, I recommend going on YouTube to hear recordings of some of the speeches that he gave. He had a beautiful speaking voice. Kilpatrick was heralded and criticised as Dewey's chief educational interpreter and as an advocate of progressive education. While it's true that Dewey was a profound influence on Kilpatrick's thinking, it's important not to underestimate their academic collegiality and abiding friendship. Over the years, Kilpatrick and Dewey collaborated on a number of significant projects, including the founding of Bennington College. Kilpatrick was actively involved in the preparations for Dewey's 70th birthday. He spoke at Dewey's 80th birthday, and for Dewey's 90th birthday, he chaired a fund committee which was established to raise $90,000, $1,000 for each year of Dewey's life, so that Dewey could use the fund to contribute financially to the causes of his choice. Kilpatrick wrote the article, The Project Method, that catapulted him to national and international fame in 1918. It had over 60,000 reprints, and it's to that article that I turn next. In it, Kilpatrick suggests that the concept of a project, or another term that he used was purposeful activity, usefully unifies such related aspects of the educative process as activity, learning theory, and the ethical quality of conduct. He decides to adopt the term project instead of purposeful activity because he says a project is suggestive of something projected, a feature I think that is overlooked in subsequent interpretations of his work. His argument in the article is deceptively simple. Starting from the premise that education is life, Kilpatrick establishes that purposeful activity is the constitutive unit of a worthwhile life. That is, a well-lived life consists in purposeful activity. We know this because we admire individuals who live purposeful lives. In the article, Kilpatrick defines purposeful activity as well-chosen, wholehearted, and self-continuing, and if there were more time, we could talk about each of those features at length. He concludes that the only way to learn to live well is to practice living well. The significant contrast then for Kilpatrick is not passivity versus activity, socialization versus emancipation, transmission versus inquiry. Purposeful activity is, he argues, a mean between a range of extremes that include compulsive activity, like checking email, texting, Instagram, Facebook on our iPhones, mechanical and routine-bound activity, like brushing our teeth, and capricious activities, like some field trips can be. Kilpatrick thought that the projects of school should reflect the variety of purposes present in life, and he identified at least 4 of those. I won't list them here, but when you hear them listed, you recognise that the projects he had in mind are not all hands-on interactions, and they include but extend beyond Dewey's focus on problem solving. There is more to say about this article, but I wish to point out, for the purpose of today's panel, one idea. Kilpatrick invites us to remember that before the term progressive was used to name a theoretical and practical approach to K-12 education, it described our involvement in experiences or activities that led on to richer possibilities. Put differently, anything we involve ourselves in has a tendency to suggest and prepare for succeeding activities. Experiences have a way of projecting us into a more challenging and fulfilling future. Understood in this way, the article The Project Method is not a recipe for how to teach by way of project-based inquiry. Rather, it is intended to show that any well-chosen, wholehearted, and self-continuing activity undertaken by an individual or a community contains within itself the method for moving into the future, if only we allow ourselves to become attuned to it. Thank you.
John Dewey, faculty member of University of Chicago, founder of the Chicago Laboratory Schools, faculty of Columbia and Teachers College, president of the Teachers Union, friend of Jane Addams, supporter of the Settlement House, critic of both the New Deal and communism, champion of art in the post office. To give context for Dewey while sitting at TC is a bit like explaining waves while sitting on a beach. John Dewey is, for all intents, the context of Teachers College. For here, from 1904 through his retirement, he found his imaginative home. His home, not because here he retreated to write ideal impossibilities, but rather to take up the long task of imagining possible transformations of a democratic society. Consider one statement from Dewey's Democracy in Education. The imagination makes what it will of chairs, blocks, leaves, chips, if they serve the purpose of carrying activity forward. For Dewey, imagination connects children to the world. Children's main activities are to interact with this world. Considering the concept of childhood means considering the necessary role of imagination in our world. Whether we are involved at playing boats or working on a boat, what allows us to move forward is the active function of our imagination. For example, when a child plays boat, she may be rowing at one moment in a calm sea, but then may be caught up in swells of a sudden storm. She may throw the blankets and pillows about in the room as she is tossed and turned. And then miraculously a landmass, perhaps say a couch, appears on the horizon, and she is tossed up on its shore. She leaps from the chairs to the couch and dramatically throws up her arms. If she, however, is engaged in making a boat, she may be calmly sitting in one of those living room chairs. She may look to the chairs for inspiration. Perhaps she may choose to make some chairs to place in her boat. She may get up from her seat and place her small crafted object, maybe made of cardboard out of a shoebox, into a small tub of water. She may push the object along and decide that a sail might assist the boat's ability to move as she pushes and blows at it. In one case, the child moves between fantasy and reality. She plays a playing boat. The chairs in the living room are not chairs, but handles for rudders and masts for sails. In the other case, the child works to make an object of the real. She works to make a floatable boat. And yet, in either case, I read Dewey as noting that the activity moves forward imaginatively. Both work and play are made possible and, in fact, retain possibility through the imagination. And in an interesting juxtaposition, Dewey writes of the child, "The real child, it hardly need be said, lives in the world of imaginative values and ideas, which find only imperfect outward embodiment. We hear much nowadays about the cultivation of the child's imagination. Then we undo much of our own talk and work by a belief that the imagination is some special part of the child that finds its satisfaction in some one particular direction, generally speaking, that of the unreal and the make-believe, of the myth and the made-up story. Why are we so hard of heart and so slow to believe? The imagination is the medium in which the child lives." End quote. What is a medium? It is the stuff of which things are not simply made on. We might say that is the canvas. But the medium is the stuff from which a painting is made, the paint. Imagination supplies the color, the palette, the possibility. A medium is the continuous activity of inward and outward motion between world and self. The imagination, then, for Dewey, is the relationship between the self and the world. The imagination is not pure fantasy, nor is it mere sensing of the world. It is sensations and self interacting. As Harriet Cruffaro notes, imagination is the means by which past and present become meaningful, connected, and the unknown future becomes related to the here and now. End quote. Transformation implies that there is change. This change is not restricted to one object, for in the moment of transformation, any interaction with such object will mean that the interaction itself has changed. Childhood is physically a reminder of such transformation. Each age of the child becomes an expression of quick growth impacted by the interaction of the environment that the child surrounds himself. Not only this natural and physical expression of transformation is found in the time of childhood. The child has to immediately interact with others. His need or her need for others and for the things of the world mean that they insert themselves as new interactions and thus new possibilities. Instead of tamping down on children's imagination or being afraid of what that interaction might mean for our society, Dewey embraces the power of childhood's capacity to engage with the new and the different. For Dewey, it is this newness that engages movement in a society in a positive direction. This is an important reminder that Dewey's great concern is to explore how inquiry into the ordinary spaces of our lives lends great meaning and great transformation. We must make room for our own imaginations to play and work with the possibilities that childhood brings us. Progressive education has long been touted as child-centered, but what this means is that our task is to imagine again and again what it means to have children play a real role in our democratic society.
Dare the school build a new social order? A question posed by George Counts that illustrates an interactive dynamic of school and society, elements of human life that can often be thought of as operating in isolation from one another. During his time at Teachers College from 1927 until his retirement in 1955, George Counts took a bold approach to the study of American culture and education. Counts suggested that traditional schooling was a tool of a dominant culture established and maintained the reproduction of oppressive social factors. If a truly progressive education is to avoid similar pitfalls, the approach of progressive education must take seriously the need for a moral direction of education and society. He saw the need for a reevaluation of education and the elimination of a stratified foundation of the American public. Using the philosophy of George Counts, the creative task ahead must negotiate the progressive education and society that is grounded in a moral equality. Counts believed the orientation of progressive education must operate to fulfill the needs and social welfare of the people. The school must provide students with the opportunity to relate the knowledge they received without the suppression or distortion of facts, allowing students to develop their own worldview given all the information. As Counts write in Dare the School to Build a New Social Order, an education that does not strive to promote the fullest and most thorough understanding of the world is not worthy of the name. He suggested a completely impartial education was impossible, and throughout a society, impositions occur through the social processes of socialization. Counts argued that impositions in education is inevitable, but this course of development should remain conscious of the goals of society: equality, morality, and inclusion. It is vital for the progression of society that students learn a comprehensive understanding of the events around them and their relation to their history, as history is not something that is just written in textbooks, but it shapes our identities, social positions, and perspectives. He believes that it is the obligation of the teacher to embrace their position of power and use their momentary authority to cultivate the minds of future generations. He argued a weakness in progressive education was the influence of what Counts identified as, quote, members of liberal-minded upper class, unquote, a selected group that although, quote, are full of goodwill and humane, unquote, are far more content with a passive observation of the world around them and avoid the harsher realities of their community. Counts suggests this group of individuals believes education should, quote, deal with life, but at a distance or a highly diluted form, unquote. Here, Counts presents another social group, much like the dominant group related to traditional schooling, also in a position of domination and attempting to control the atmosphere of education. In essence, keeping their children away from what they believe to be detrimental aspects of society. Counts argues that, quote, if progressive education is to be genuinely progressive, it must emancipate itself from the influence of this class, face squarely and courageously every social issue, come to the grips of life in all of its stark reality, establish an organic relation with the community, develop a realistic comprehension of social welfare, fashion a compelling and challenging vision of human destiny, and become less frightened than it is today with bogies of imposition and indoctrination, unquote. Counts' view of progressive education is that of an inclusive nature, with individuals ready to take action to develop the status of society. It should not fall to the influence of passive or the idle few that believe progressive education is just another privileged commodity. One cannot appropriate the school the sole solution to the troubles of society. As Counts attempted to negotiate the interconnection of school and society, they must work as a unified effort towards morality and equality. He stressed the importance of various elements of society that must also play their roles in the development of individuals. We all learn from different aspects of society in the socialization process. As we continue the progressive education movement, let us keep upmost in our minds the goals of societal morality and equality, stepping out of our individualized realms and engage in profound interaction and dialogue with one another. Let us move from behind the two-sided mirror in a mere observation of progressive education and engage in effective dialogue. We cannot manipulate the course of education to satisfy the desires of society in the society's needs of a new generation of exploited labor power. Developing an open and honest interaction and engagement with one another while we continue to cultivate our own identity in conjunction with a truly progressive education. That is what I believe George Counts understood as the future of society and education. And in the spirit of George Counts, I'd like to take this moment to have my own action. I'd like to share my belief in the possibility of society to actually transcend the social boundaries that we've established for one another. We find ourselves all individually unique, but with a collective equality. Much like education, however, standardization does not mean equality. So I would like to have everybody keep that in mind. And I will end on this quote from George Counts. Until the school and society are bound together by common purposes, the program of education will lack both meaning and vitality. Thank you.
How does one, in just a few minutes, offer adequate and appropriate testimony to the thought, teaching, and vision of Maxine Greene, let alone before an audience and within a place of learning to which she has meant so much? How does one offer a portrait of Maxine Greene that does justice to the full range of her work and life? A task unapproachable for sure, and yet encountering even just the smallest sampling of her contribution, just one of her books, essays, lectures, courses, interviews, letters, editorials, forwards, salons. Just one of these bestows so many impressions. And that is what I would like to just begin to offer here, impressions of Maxine Greene. I think impressions is a term that Maxine would appreciate, given the emphasis that she has always placed on the immense scope of human experience and her hope in our ability to awaken and remain open to experience, a hallmark, as we have heard today, of many thinkers in the progressivist tradition. Admittedly, impressions is not a term that Maxine Greene has cultivated and tended with as much carefulness of thought as she has so many others. Terms like imagination, awakenings, future, transformation, renewal, possibilities. Terms that, when wedded to words like education, teaching, curriculum, and school, can hardly be uttered today without acknowledging Maxine. Still, I think impressions is as adequate and appropriate an offering that I can give today. And I would like to offer just some of my impressions of just one of Maxine's books, perhaps least important to the many that know and use her work, but I would have to say the most important to me. It is her edited collection, Existential Encounters for Teachers. That's right, an anthology that she edited in 1967, for which she wrote just an 18-page introduction, sprinkled with brief commentaries that follow her selected excerpts from existentialists such as Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Dostoevsky, Camus, and several more. The first impression of this book is its title. Notice that it does not read existentialism for teachers, as if to indicate that the entries would serve to introduce teachers to a school or system of thought from which to deduce educational statements and principles to apply to classroom practice. Not existentialism, but existential encounters. Encounters with writers that might move teachers to, as she puts it, self-awareness, to confrontation of one's predicaments, to identification with oneself. Here is an arrangement, a curriculum that brings into play the core of one's existence, or life itself, as Dewey would say. A progressive curriculum, for sure. This leads me to a second impression of the book, the opening sentence of the introduction. She writes, simply but boldly, "To teach in the American school today is to undertake a profoundly human as well as professional responsibility." With this sentence, Maxine establishes her celebrated commitment to upholding and demanding the dignity of the teacher, teaching here as the ethical, political, and aesthetic project of a full-fledged human being. And with this sentence, she also stakes her claim that teacher education is a professional and humanistic discipline, that the inquiries of art, literature, and philosophy are formative for the teacher, and that the craft of teaching itself contributes to understanding in the humanities as much as any other domain of knowledge. My third and concluding impression of this book. Maxine includes selections from 16 different existential writers. I should point out that Walter Kaufmann's anthology, often considered the gold standard in philosophy departments throughout the country, includes just 11 authors. With this impression, I am reminded of how Maxine is the most well-read philosopher of education I have ever encountered. For example, one I selected at random, her first chapter of the brilliant The Dialectic of Freedom begins by citing a T.S. Eliot poem, then a quote from Virginia Woolf, then another from Dewey, on to Arendt, Foucault, Christopher Lasch, Isaiah Berlin, Sartre, E.D. Hirsch, Charles Taylor, Milan Kundera, Merleau-Ponty, Sherwood Anderson, and so on and so on. I am certain that everyone here has had the impression from reading Maxine's work or attending one of her seminars that she is inviting us to take part in a conversation that she has heard taking place in the great community. She does not offer a final interpretation of this conversation, but instead offers suggestions, signposts, that might point us to that great task ahead of us. In her words, to remake by means of education. Thank you.
Well, I want to first congratulate our panelists for accepting the impossible task of summarizing the vision and practice of four great philosophers of education in just a few minutes. I think we could see in their artful overviews of these four people's work just how, not just how powerful their ideas are and were and are, but how influential they were on progressive education and how timely they continue to be in the year 2013. So on that note, I'd like to invite you in the audience to raise any questions that occurred to you while listening, any comments you'd like to share. And I think what we'll do is we have a little bit of time here is maybe take a couple of questions, comments in a row without us commenting, give you a chance to do a little bit of speaking, and then we'll respond. So far, what I hear is the following, and maybe I'll ask the panelists if you'd like to respond to any of these. We have a question about respect or lack of respect for teachers in the United States. Related to that, we have a question about are we supporting teachers or punishing teachers? What's the approach we take in educational policy towards working with teachers? We have a question about civility, the place of civility in education, the place of civility in society. At least that's one question I heard. And then one other, I'm not going to summarize all of them, but one other was just what we heard about the relation between educators and society, issues of agency and connectedness. Would anyone on the panel like to respond to one or another of those comments, questions? Yeah.
The policy that was, is this on? And I think George Counts would say that's where the importance of understanding the history of an individual and how they relate to the history, because when a new policy is introduced that might be seemingly exploitation of a new market of people or what have you, a previous understanding of what those past policies have done and how they've affected us today might prevent similar policies from introducing itself or presenting itself in society.
I'd like to maybe respond to the question and comment regarding the comparison of a kind of cultural recognition and respect of teachers elsewhere as compared to here. I was wondering, and if you can maybe sort of flesh it out, were you referring to kind of economic?
No, I was referring to briefly Eastern Europe and Central Europe as well as teaching. I'm referring to what led me to think of it. Sorry, the gentleman in front, Mr. Hansen, when he talked about whatever someone may call power.
Oh.
In the other countries that I've taught in, the amount of respect accorded to teachers is to say something in general. It's not that you're going to do it, there's less backup, less, well, I'm going to trust you, but I'm going to verify right away, or the parents are going to call right away, or this needs to be done because there's a job coming in their college. There's more of a trust. This person knows what they're, you're right, knows what they're doing. My student is in your hands, I have to respect it. And we're back here in America, we're not one too. Constant question. You really
Right.
I'm in my job, you don't really know it because you're quote unquote just a teacher. So for example, in the principal office, the amount of times I was told you shouldn't be doing this because you're just a teacher was huge. So I hope that helps. It's not an economic question.
Right. Okay. Well, now I'm not sure I want to respond to it.
I wasn't trying to intimidate.
I mean, initially, it's a obviously a very complex issue, and now I'm hearing more clearly that you're talking more about a kind of respect as, yeah, a kind of a respect for the authority of the teacher.
And that's why I was saying to the gentleman,
Right.
right about the social impact and spoken about that. I didn't know what the cultural social aspect, in your guys' opinion, might.
Right. I've really struggled with not so much the comparative issue, but more so the lack of, and I sort of mentioned this here, and this is why, for me, and specifically the book I cited of Maxine Greene's Existential Encounters for Teachers, is this idea that the teacher has a dignity and an integrity, not just insofar as she is a person, of course, but that a person who is a teacher is engaged in a task of the self, what I refer to here as an ethical, political, and aesthetic project of a full-fledged human being. And one of the sort of complicating issues, I think, is that in our culture, we esteem a kind of self-sacrificial teacher, one who, and this, you sort of read it in the headlines whenever there are stories about teachers, this honoring of the teacher who sacrifices oneself, whether it's economically or otherwise, for the sake of their students. There are many critics in the field of philosophy of education who think that that's something, that notion of self-sacrifice needs to be sort of given up, and we need to support teachers. I agree with that, but at the same time, I also see a kind of a valuable ethos in this notion that someone enters a classroom for others, not for gain, not for recognition, but in the service of and with the young, others, and who sees their project, although for oneself, as something also that transcends themselves. I don't know if that, that's my response. Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I think my comment follows that discussion a bit, and it's a short comment, but I think it's one that John Dewey would, or at least one could read in John Dewey's works. And it moves to the question of agency and connectiveness that was posed last. And one of the, I think there's always a question of authority and where that authority comes from. But one of the things that I think happens with teachers and their work in the classrooms is that it stems from a dismissal of ordinary life. So teachers do with really minute things every day. And I work a lot with teachers and educators who work with early childhood ages. So there's things like going to the bathroom and passing out snack. It takes up a lot of time. And people dismiss the importance of looking into those ordinary things. And what that leads to is a dismissal of the teacher herself or himself who's dealing with those ordinary tasks every day. One of the things that also I think might lead to is a dismissal of the teacher's agency to make changes in those ordinary lives, in those ordinary schedules. And I think that agency can be recovered or more revealed when teachers and educators and teacher educators work on connecting and helping initiate some connections between teachers themselves and teachers in the communities that they're working in, and the other institutions in that community. So I think that a lot of times we talk about individual agency, but I think Dewey points us to looking at what happens when we look at collective agency.
I would suggest that it wouldn't be the physical atmosphere of the school that's most important. It's the relation to the school and society. The school can't do it all by itself. There are other elements of society and socialization that must contribute and play their roles. If the school, regardless of the atmosphere, it could be inside a building or outside, if there's a serious level of discourse and engagement that understands the student's relation to the outside community, the school can't happen in isolation. You need other people. But how does the other people, society, those who may or may not be different from one another, relate to one another? Where can you find those connections? And I think that's where the true progressive element of George Counts comes in, the equality and the search for equality on a moral basis.
And maybe I could comment too. I think your comment about victimization, sort of the Rodney Dangerfield, I don't get no respect as a teacher. Maybe we can link that with your question about the era of accountability, because I think the two go together. I think the one reason that the profession of teaching feels a bit under assault is not being at the table and having a lot of direct influence on this era of top-down accountability. I think what progressive education has done for decades, because there's always been, you might say, tension, if not conflict, between large-scale educational policy and life on the ground. I think one thing progressive education has done very well is, in fact, not to get caught up into notions of victimization, but to attend to what's happening at 9:17 in the morning in that classroom, and to try to completely realize as fully as possible one's agency as a teacher, to think of the word that you added, Jim, agency. I'm so struck by every school I've been in my career over the last 30 years, there are good teachers, without exception. I've been in hundreds of schools, but it's so below the surface of our media, it's so below the surface of what we hear about publicly in our discussions. So I think the progressive impulse is to remember, and I liked a lot what Stephanie said, is the ordinary, the everyday, what we do each moment that we're with the students. There's a tremendous creative thing happening right now in our country, thanks to so many teachers that are working away. So it's a tension, the pressure on teachers. How do we speak back to that pressure, while also doing what we do so well and so creatively, and that's the moment with the student. That's one response. I don't know if, Megan, please.
If I could just add to that, I think what Kilpatrick encourages us to do in looking at the ordinary is to expand our notion of human agency and human connectedness. And the list of projects that he discusses in his article include having an aesthetic experience, or developing a skill, or going to the bathroom. So I think the irony is that given that Kilpatrick is the person we associate with activity and hands-on interaction, really when you read him, his focus is on how can we engage in the activities we engage in purposefully. Because if we engage in them purposefully as teachers, as students, as individuals, then we continue ourselves into the future. And it reminded me of the quotation from Goethe that Lawrence Kremen began his second volume with, "We let them be who they must be," or something to that effect.
And I'd like to also just briefly respond to your question in the back about that you asked to Jahsee. How do we sort of break the hold of a kind of privileged class, or a sort of a status quo approach to the system? I think one of the ways that I know Teachers College does that and has for a century is to take very seriously that second word that Larry Kremen thought was important, and that's pluralism. Teacher education here in the college today, and I know in the past, I've got a lot of outstanding colleagues here, Megan among them and others, takes really seriously how any kind of school, charter, independent, public, can be a place where you really try to cultivate an equity orientation, a justice orientation. It can be done in kindergarten, it can be done in 12th grade, but it's a kind of orientation that you try to take out into the world. That's sort of one way that people on the ground again are trying to address that. I see Fran in the back is telling us we're out of time, but let me just. Well, maybe do we have a benedictory comment here? I have one comment, but in the last. I guess with 30 seconds to go, first let me just ask all of us to thank our presenters one more time for this delightful session. We do have copies on the table over here of a handbook chapter on progressive education and curriculum that's been written by a number of folks here in our program in philosophy and education. So we'd offer that to you as a memento. This chapter was inspired by a line from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's a figure who's behind, I think, all four figures that we've heard about this morning. He says, "Truly speaking, it is not instruction I can receive from another, but provocation." And we hope you've enjoyed this provocation this morning from our program. Thank you.